The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am at the Exeter Cathedral Library with Emma Laws. Emma, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Nice to have you.
I'm so excited to be here today. Can you just start off by telling my listeners a little bit about the library here?
Yes, well, we think the library predates the cathedral very slightly. It was established by the first bishop here, Leofric, who came here from Crediton in 1050. We have the foundation charter here, which sets out the sort of details of the ceremony. And he was here until 1072. And we know what he gave to his cathedral church because there is a donation list. And it lists the books that were in his library that he left to the cathedral. Wow. And there were 66 books, which doesn't sound like an awfully big library by today's standards, but it was a very sizable library at that time. And one of those 66 books remains today, which is the Exeter book. Wow. And that's the oldest book of English literature in the world.
Very old.
Very old, yes. But that was the foundation of the library, and it's grown since then.
Mm. So today we're here to look at a very special document that I'm so excited to see. Can you tell us what we're going to be looking at today?
So, as it says on the cover here, this is one of the authenticated copies of the will of Henry VIII. It doesn't look like a will.
No.
It's bound as you would bind a book. And in fact, the document itself, it only takes up the first few pages. Mm. And then in order to bind it as a book, a lot of spare blank pages have been bound in at the end to support it, I suppose, in the format of a book. This is not, the binding is not contemporary with the will.
It's not, okay.
This to me looks like a very Victorian binding. Probably it was bound by possibly the owner who gave us the book at the end of the 19th century. Yes, wow. Red Morocco. It's bound in a way that shows how precious the item was, I think.
And it says 1546, and if my history is right, it was December 30th?
Yes.
That he wrote his last will?
Yes. That it was signed, yes.
This is just great. So the binding was likely Victorian. The sheets inside, were they vellum? What were they made out of?
No, so if we have a look at here, these are paper, and you can see it's been very nicely bound, and someone has bothered to go to the effort of repairing it in the corners. So it's been very nicely presented. In order to preserve it. I think probably when I think of a will, I think of something sort of rolled up like a scroll with a seal on it or something like that. But in a way, this is almost a little incongruous to bind it like it's a book. But I suspect whoever did this did it because this was the best format to protect it. It's quite a fragile document, but this binding's really sturdy.
That's good. It's protecting it. I think I expected a large sheet of vellum with a big black seal at the bottom. This is not what I expected at all.
No, but this is it's an authenticated copy. So as I understand it, each of the executors of Henry VIII's will was given a copy of the will. So there should be other ones in existence. I know of a few, and they're all a little bit different. But this is our copy, and it has quite an interesting sort of story behind it.
Yeah, let's talk about that story.
So we had a former librarian here in the 1930s called Herbert Eustace Bishop, which is a bit complicated because he's not a bishop, but that was his name. And so according to him, he was rummaging around in the bureau of Harrington, Edward Charles Harrington, who is one of our donors who gave us a collection towards the end of the 19th century. And he was rummaging around in the bureau, and he comes across this will. And I don't think it's a case that he's discovered it for the first time. I think we knew it was here, but I think he felt that perhaps people didn't know it as well as they could.
Sure. Yeah.
So he wrote and published a little piece on it in which he tells the story of how it has come to the cathedral library. And it seems to have come down through the family of Edward Charles Harrington. Now, Harrington was he was a prebendary here. He was a canon. I think in 1856 he became a resident canon of Exeter. So he has a very strong link. He obviously amassed a private library, and he left that library to us. So possibly we think this has come down through the Harrington family, because at the front there's some material at the front of the manuscript. So here we have a little bit of evidence about the indication of the provenance. So the backstory is really, I suppose, written in this inscription, which says that this was given by the hand of Queen Elizabeth to Sir John Harrington, AD 1590. So this, if we are to believe it, is Queen Elizabeth I's giving Sir John Harrington a copy of her father's will. Now, Sir John Harrington was a godson. I think she had about 100 godsons.
Probably.
But he was apparently her favourite godson. And he's known actually for devising, I think, one of the first England's first flushing toilet. But that is another that's another story. But she, according to this inscription, gives this copy of the will to Sir John Harrington, her sort of favourite godson. So presumably that's how it ends up in the Harrington family. But we do know a little bit more about the story before that. So how does it end up in his hands? Why is Elizabeth giving it to him? So that's another part of the story. And how did Elizabeth come to have this particular copy?
Yeah. Because
there were 16 executors.
Yes.
So why has she got this copy? So the story, we think, is that, so this copy, we believe, is the copy that was given to the Bishop of Durham, who was called Bishop Tunstall.
Yes.
And
Cuthbert.
Yes.
Yes.
And he, when Elizabeth first came to the throne, Bishop Tunstall refused to take the oath of supremacy, and refused to take part in the ceremony of which saw Matthew Parker become Archbishop of Canterbury. So he is arrested, Tunstall is arrested, and he's imprisoned at Lambeth Palace, and he dies there. A few weeks later, he's 85 years old. But Archbishop Parker writes a letter, which is now at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, stating that the executors of Tunstall's will found among his papers at Lambeth Palace a sort of package containing the will. So evidence suggests that this copy belonged to Bishop Tunstall. And there is evidence to suggest that Bishop Tunstall had intended his items at Lambeth Palace to be passed to Elizabeth I. So if you join the dots, this is the copy that Tunstall had at Lambeth Palace. He wanted his few documents to be passed to Elizabeth I. If that then happened, this is the copy that she had that she then passed to Harrington. And then through that family ended up here. It's a convoluted story.
Yes, but what a great story with all these big Tudor names connected to it. I mean, What a great provenance.
Exactly. No, exactly. And there is a letter at the front of this that which sort of explains this, that there's one roll of books which he purposed to deliver to the Queen, which is nothing else but King Henry's testament. Which I find sort of quite an odd way of saying. It's almost quite dismissive. Oh, there's nothing in there.
Just his testament.
Just Henry VIII, copy of Henry VIII's will. So yes, and that is a copy of the letter. So it's,
Do Do we know what the other copies look like? Are they bound like this? Do you have any idea?
I know. I haven't been able to track, or I haven't tried to track all of them. There is one that's available online. Actually, there's a piece online. It's the one that is the copy at the Society of Antiquaries in London. And I mean, there must be, the others must be somewhere, and I don't know. But they even know the scribe of theirs. We haven't tried to investigate who the scribe of ours is. So there's still information to discover about our copy. But I think looking at that, ours against the image of that copy, they are quite different.
Oh, really?
Different hand, I think.
They probably are.
Yeah, different. So presumably with different scribes writing.
Yeah.
I would imagine. But we
Especially
don't know.
16 copies. That's a lot of copies. I was always under the impression, and now I realize how wrong I was, that there was 1, maybe 2 copies, not 16.
Well, I imagine there were 16. They were given, but they were also given money. So I think we know that Tunstall was given 300 pounds.
Okay.
Which would be a lot of money.
Yes.
In that time. Yeah.
Back then.
And then a copy of the will.
Wow. It's just so amazing to be sitting here next to this document, knowing how old it is.
Yes.
And probably the most famous thing about Henry VIII's will is his signature, right?
Yes. And
can we take a look at this?
So, well, this is where, I mean, I suppose some, you know, there's all sorts of debate around the authenticity of the wills. I imagine if Henry VIII had wanted to, he could have spent all day, every day signing documents. So he had what I sort of see as a bit similar to a digital signature today, when you're filling in an online form and you sign your name, but it's not you, is it? But it's a digital signature. So he had a dry stamp that was used for signing his documents. So someone would, so he didn't have to sign, and the stamp would be used, and then somebody went over it in ink to create the signature. Wow. Ours has got a little
hole, maybe
hole there.
Yes.
Yeah. And so of course some people say, well, is it actually signed by Henry VIII? And you know, but I think we have to accept it as authentic, because otherwise are to assume that all the documents that were produced towards the end of his reign are not to be taken as authentic, because he's not signed them. Right. I mean, you know, they've introduced the stamp in order for it to be a legitimate signature. So I think we have to assume that is the way that we. And
looking at it now, there's no way that you would know that that's a stamp. At least not from my eye. It looks like it's part of the whole thing.
It looks like it's part of it. Yeah. Yeah.
And the whole theory that the will was changed after his death, looking at this, and if there were 16 copies.
It seems unlikely. I mean, I think now I think those sort of stories and conspiracy theories are perhaps sort of put to rest. I mean, to me, you know, the idea that wills were forged, or he was somehow coerced at the end of his life into writing something. But you have so many executives of the will, and are we to believe that they were all in on a sort of conspiracy, and then didn't later sort of mention it in passing to somebody? You know?
Yeah.
I mean,
look what we got away with.
I mean, and actually, I think for some of them, I mean, I don't know details, but surely, I mean, Bishop Tunstall ended up imprisoned in Lambeth Palace. I mean, you know, was there not a moment when he might have revealed something if it hadn't been all
and being a bishop?
Exactly. So I don't know. I don't know if I can quite believe that there was foul play. And you know, actually, interestingly, that we always think of wills as you know, legally binding, where everything that in a will takes, you know, happens. But actually, lots of things in the will were not adhered to. So if they're not adhered to, then it suggests that perhaps, you know, it is genuinely Henry VIII's thoughts and wishes.
Let's talk about some of the contents of the will. What do you find interesting in here?
Well, I think one of the key things, I suppose, about the will is the fact that he puts down who he wants to be his heirs, which, you know, hadn't been done before. And clearly they didn't adhere to it. But it's interesting that he you know, people talk about him wanting to rule from the grave, and I find that fascinating that he would stipulate that in his will, and also bring Elizabeth and Mary back in, even though they had sort of been illegitimate, and but he brings them back in and mentions them in his will, in his sort of list. I mean, that's quite an interesting.
He had a legacy to preserve, and even if his daughters were illegitimate, they were going to extend the Tudor dynasty for him. Very
keen to do so. And I think also he sets out what he wanted for his son, and I think, you know, perhaps that didn't happen exactly as he'd planned. But it is interesting. This is a document of his wishes,
right? They're not commands; they're wishes.
They're wishes, and you know, as much as he probably hoped it would happen after his death, he's not going to be there to actually make sure it does. So.
No. And what's the other thing that he wanted that didn't necessarily happen? When we talk about his tomb.
Yes. So well, that's the other interesting thing, is that he dies as a traditionalist. That he, you know, this whole will is full of stipulations for his soul and for his personal faith, and it's full of things that perhaps we would think, well, hold on a minute, that we've had the Reformation, and why are you wanting to have an altar at Windsor so people can go there and pray for your soul, you know, or why are you sort of leaving money you know, in return for people praying for your soul? So it's interesting that, I mean, I do wonder, I mean, who knows, but to me it would make sense that he feels a little bit of turmoil at the end of his life on his deathbed. You know, I mean, he's had lots of political reasons for the Reformation, but perhaps privately he's still a traditionalist. And I mean, starts off right at the beginning of the will, you know, here we have the first line, to glorious blessed Virgin Our Lady Mary, and the whole company of heaven. You know, that's right in the first line, isn't it?
I mean, he was raised Catholic. I think it's hard when you're raised a certain religion to then suddenly change midlife.
Absolutely.
And
he's not only changed for his, you know, life for himself and his own personal faith, but for everybody. Yes. And that's quite a weight on his shoulders, I well be. But at the end, he wants people to pray for his soul, and you know, and to intercede for him.
I don't know why I just love that part of his story so much, that he went through all of this trouble to marry Anne Boleyn to get this heir that he wanted so badly, and at the end, here we are. He looks very Catholic.
Yes.
And he didn't get the tomb that he wanted.
He didn't get the tomb that he wanted. But yeah, I mean, it is fascinating. It is. And I mean, we know that at the end of his life, with the 6 articles, he had started to sort of slightly revert back. So this just sort of comes at the end of that process. Not surprising, really.
No.
To me, but
it does make me wonder what it was like to be one of his subjects. How confusing that must have been to know which way to go.
Yes, and then but got more confusing after his death, because you have Edward VI that reign felt almost more brutal. Then of course you have Mary, so everything reverts back again. And I mean, we know ended up, we have a missal here, it was printed in 1555 in Paris, where she orders copies to be printed in Paris and brought back to be disseminated, because the Latin Missal had been got rid of, and she wants to return to the Latin Missal, but she has to just to reprint it. So people must have been very confused, because this is quite a short space of time that you're sort of seesawing back and forth between, you know, just on a very sort of on a personal level, between the Latin Missal, the English Book of Common Prayer, you know, the Bible, the Latin Vulgate Bible, the Bible in English, and watch, and a time of terrible turmoil.
Most definitely. I always think of the children that were born after the Reformation, or after Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn and everything started changing. They only knew a certain type of England, and then Mary came to the throne, and then they were in the same boat going, oh, hang on a second. We knew this religion, and now we have
this one.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and I think once you get to Elizabeth, you have a certain stability, simply because I think she reigned longer than Mary or Edward. Or and I think stability does eventually bring, or that length of reign does bring stability. But yeah, very messy before then.
This is such a cool document. I just can't believe I'm in the same room with this right now. This is, I just want to pinch myself a little bit. How do you store something like this to make sure that it's preserved?
So we're very lucky here. We have an environmentally controlled store. So it's sort of a bit like the Goldilocks, sort of not too hot, not too cold, not too dry, not too damp, just right. And so it's carefully monitored. And of course, we don't just put it on the shelf like this. So it's in a case. But yes, I mean, when you're touching it and handling it, and of course we don't handle it too much, but you are handling a piece of the past. You know, you are holding the past in your hands, and there is you can learn about the Reformation and you can learn about Henry VIII, but when you actually have an object in front of you, there is a very tangible link with the past, and that is our job. And we're not historians here. We look after objects, and we hope that we can tell stories about them and get people excited about it through the object, you know, and showing people, look, this is really, really old, you know. Yes. But it's great. I mean, it's great to work with these objects.
Yeah. One of the things that I want to ask you about, because I know it's inevitable, somebody's going to make a comment somewhere about this, to wear gloves or not to wear gloves when it comes to this. And I understand both sides of the argument. Yes. I would love to hear what you have to say.
So we wash our hands before we handle objects. Gloves are very tricky. So there are times when you would wear gloves for handling photographs and for handling metal objects. For books, actually, I think using gloves is worse. You don't have the sensitivity you need to turn pages. And yeah, so we are gloves off, but clean hands.
Which makes sense. If you have gloves on, you don't know.
You can't feel
Right. So you could be a little more rough with it than you know you are. And this way, with your fingers, you can tell.
Yes. You're far more conscious about handling with your hands than when you have gloves on. Yeah.
This is great. So we know you have this will of Henry VIII. What other items? What other treasures do you have?
Well, we have other materials relating to the Reformation. So we have a copy of Fox's Book of Martyrs, which of course we would have, because each cathedral was given a copy, and you know, it would have been kept on display originally in the cathedral, and that's the book with all those woodcuts of people being burned at the stake, and it's quite it's gruesome, but it's very powerful. It's very visual. There's two stories in that from Exeter, because Thomas Bennett in Exeter was, our first Protestant martyr here, who pinned a little scroll to the Great West Door saying, the Pope is Antichrist and we should pray directly just to God. So, and he has his, there's a summary of his life and his martyrdom in Fox's Book of Martyrs with a woodcut of him at the stake. So it's amazing. We have the 1552 copy of the Book of Common Prayer.
You do?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
And then we also have the 1555 Missal, which replaced it under Mary before we went back again. And we do have theological works here. As we're a cathedral library, so we have particularly the works of Richard Hooker, who was very much the sort of finding a middle way in Anglicanism between Catholics and Protestants. And so yes, we have, but we also have a lot of other treasures as well. So
I'm so envious. I can't even. Where's this archive? I want to go break in and look at everything. Sitting here is just. It's been such a pleasure to be able to look at this. What kind of access does the public have to your archives?
So we're open to the public. We're by appointment, partly because we have a small reading room. So but yes, I mean, and something like this object, we would, if we started getting it out every day for someone, then we would probably think, oh, hold on a minute, we need to sort of balance a bit of access and preservation. But we are publicly available, and people can make appointments to come in and see our treasures.
So if somebody wants to make an appointment, how do they go about doing that?
They just email. They just email us.
Go to your website.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, you can go to the website and find our email address. Yeah.
Okay.
And yes, we welcome everyone to come and have a look.
That's wonderful. Emma, thank you so much for allowing me in this room with you today to look at this amazing document. It has been such a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure too.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.